For our pitch, we chose a combination of genres to work with, including the Western, the fantasy, and the sci-fi. They can work well together if there are elements apparent through the use of story, costume, and character. We were influenced by films such as The Warrior and the Sorceress, Krull, Outland, Ator, and The Sword and the Sorcerer. As the pitch for Mycteria started to come together, we started to work out character types, creature concepts, and story arcs over the course of the Mycteria trilogy. This concept would work well as a trilogy since there would be room for the characters to shine through, the story to feel epic, and for some exciting battle and war sequences, as well as to take in the world and its scenery, which is like nothing anybody has ever seen before. At heart, we are attempting to revive the sword and sorcery epic of the 80s, bring it to modern times, and to excite and thrill viewers with the biggest film of their generation. Mycteria belongs to the fantasy, sci-fi, and western, since it is set on a different world, inhabited by mythical creatures, barbarous warriors, evil sorcerers, castles, forts, keeps, forests, ancient deserts, women warriors, and two ethereal beings battling it out for the good or evil of the universe. It features elements of the western, the heroic journey over the valleys, mountains. The battles are going to draw off elements of the gunslingers, and the costumes are hearkening to that genre as well. It draws on the fantasy and sci-fi genre by introducing strange planets, creatures, and ideas, as well as interesting concepts, far-out stories, and heroic characters. Sci-fi as a genre always took us to new frontiers, although telling us a message through the story that they were telling. In Jurassic Park, it taught us that nature always wins in the end. Fantasy as a genre is associated with many other genres, mostly sci-fi, but also including things like medieval films and adventure films. Fantasy films have always had a wide range of stories that they explore over the decades, from fairy tales to stories like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Journey to the Center of the Earth. Whereas sci-fi is breaking barriers into the unknown, fantasy can draw on these elements, but can also change it into a period piece, such as Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Fantasy and sci-fi, although similar, are strikingly different. The sci-fi explores themes of the human and non-human, as well as what constitutes humanity. The fantasy genre is more along the lines of good versus evil, magic, civilization, and mythology, but what makes the genre different is the plausibility of its narrative elements. We are drawing upon the visual element of the sci-fi with the stark colours, the different visual style of landscape, and unusual creatures. We have chosen these elements to push our story into the unknown and to make it visually interesting and stunning. Fantasy elements we are drawing off are the sword and sorcery and hero's journey elements to give our story a massive potential. We are also using some western features, such as a gunslinger, sword fights which will harken to gunfights, the barren lands and the small towns to give off a sense of desolation to Mycteria. Our production reflects themes of the western, with the costumes which consist of ponchos and western-type boots. Our main protagonist harkens to the gunslinger and is a mystery to many of the townsfolk that he encounters on his journey. Many fear him and know he is capable of powers beyond comprehension. The sword fights and mannerisms are also reminiscent of the gunfighter. The setting in the town of Mycteria also references a western, but changes it enough to fit in with the sword and sorcery genre. The theme of fantasy is everywhere, from the castles, to the towns, to the clothing, to the characters themselves. The landscapes are beautiful but strange. A lot of different colours are used for the hills, mountains, trees, and earth. Everything, it looks very, very different from everything that you see on Earth. Everything is ancient, weathered. The people are garbed in medieval-style clothing with sci-fi elements such as glowing amulets and clocks worn on the wrist that tell the time of day. These are a cross between a sundial and a futuristic watch, and powered by a mystical gem. The character types such as warrior, mage, thief, and warrior woman fit really well both into the sci-fi genre as well as the fantasy. It reflects the magic, the barbarous nature of the fantasy genre, as well as the splendor and the mystery of the unknown. It reflects the sci-fi genre by introducing larger themes such as extraterrestrials, future technology, fear, and the future of the past, as our film tells of the history of Mycteria. It reflects themes of the Western such as a wilderness and civilization, as our hero is bred in the harsh, barren wilderness and travels to civilization to protect what there is of Mycteria. Our film also explores the individual and community, as our hero learns that being alone is not as important as it is to be part of a community or group that will help you out of tricky situations. It has creatures that you have never seen before. For example, steeds that are part sea crustacean, part seahorse, and part crab that can float on the air. These creatures can do this since they are also made differently from every other person on the planet. As the world evolved suited the sea Bafadu creatures. Dark magic was involved also, but many of the creatures rebelled against it, becoming independent. As you can see, we've added quite the depth and history of everything on the planet. In Mycteria, there are many different creatures, such as the Bahadril being only one. The landscape is also very different to ours. Some buildings look as though they could not have been built on the surface they are on, skewing out from a variety of different angles, and floating cities are also scattered across the skyline of the planet. The colours are also different, many trees being blue or purple, or even starkly orange. An eternal autumn in some lands make the trees a shade of black, worked up by the sorcery from Fargrand, the Mountain of Doom, stronghold of Necrond. The landscapes are breathtaking, which will be large on scale and will have a sense of depth and clarity not seen in any other motion picture before. Since our film also focuses on two ethereal beings warring against each other, it will be a whole different concept in the character's design of the protagonist and antagonist.
The mixture of genres is an important aspect of Mycteria. The hybridity between fantasy, sci-fi, and the Western will all act as strong aesthetic and thematic influences towards the success of this story. I would say the dominant genre is certainly fantasy, simply due to the story at play and the similarities between classic fantasy films like The Sword and the Sorcerer and Dragon Slayer. However, I cannot stress enough the importance of the genre hybrid at work. This story only works if audiences can feel familiar aspects of each genre but in a refreshing new circumstance. Mycteria will belong to the world of film. However, it is far from restricted to it. The medium of film will serve as the major driving force of the story, but will be expanded and explored to a far deeper level. The reasoning for this is that it allows us to stray away from the broad target audience and really cater to the people that feel invested and connected in the world brought to life on screen. Although, I see this shifting the priority out of focus, as Mycteria will give audiences a reason to look towards a classic cinema experience, something that rarely comes by in today's era. Mycteria will not set out to revive the classical form of the fantasy, sci-fi, or western genres, but will instead be inspired by such and twist them into something fresh that will have audiences on the edge of their seats. With the planning of a trilogy, we have set out to have each film primarily focused on one of the three aesthetic forms. For example, the first film will, although carry the themes and storytelling scene consistent between all three, it will look like a western. This will give the establishing film a more rugged look, taking inspiration from westerns like For a Few Dollars More and Django Unchained. The second film will pull aesthetically from Interstellar and Blade Runner 2049, creating a strong sci-fi atmosphere, while the final, obviously grand conclusion will pull deeply aesthetically wise from strong fantasy epics like Thor and Lord of the Rings. Do not be mistaken, however. There will be a consistency between the three films in terms of their overarching story and the overlap of iconography, whether that be from the gunslinger type hero and the focus on his weapon, in this case a sword, or even the humanoid creatures that will heavily reflect something from a sci-fi film. More on this later on. The major production company backing this franchise is Warner Brothers. The way they handled the Lord of the Rings franchise really speaks to the fantasy type epic in which we are trying to achieve. The new additions, being the inclusion of the sci-fi and western genres, does nothing less than bring in a larger audience. We saw Lord of the Rings lean into the fantasy genre, which we believe actually locked out a major portion of cinema goers, and the numbers for those movies were nothing short of phenomenal. Opening up, however, to larger audiences with the inclusion of sci-fi and western elements is really an attempt to speak to everyone on some level. Sticking to the prime display of this story being the film medium, the target audience has been broadened to a worldwide scale. This will work hand in hand with the marketing plan surrounding this trilogy. Everything will follow the thought process behind a once-in-a-generational event. The point being to get as much buzz and built up hype throughout communities that even people not staying up to date with the latest in the film industry, or those who have no interest in attending at all, will know the name Mycteria. Today's demand for diversity in films does nothing more than benefit this film. With names like Hayley Atwell, Christopher Walken, Michael B. Jordan, and many more, the diversity between the cast, whether it be gender, age, or race, will result in something for everyone. An important factor between the casting was to make sure every audience member has someone they can see a part of themselves in.
The narrative image is an interesting blend of sci-fi and fantasy. Because there are many different types of environments shown throughout the film, the colour scheme might not be as cohesive as that of a science fiction, but the colour emphasis will always be on enhancing the environment, which in turn heightens the scale of epic, vast environments explored throughout Mycteria, like endlessly spanning deserts or dense forests. Examples of this can be seen in Lord of the Rings, with bright greens complementing the friendly nature of the Shire, but the scheme dramatically changes when they're climbing the treacherous mountain Kurahadris, where the scheme still complements the landscape, but it heightens the darker elements. As well as colour, the aesthetics of the film are an interesting hybrid of fantasy and science fiction, with almost alien-like creatures to complement the familiar earthen landscapes, roaming free, as well as performing the role of animals in fantasy films, carrying carriages, livestock, etc. The architecture of the film is also interesting, delving into Western influences in some smaller towns, and medieval influences in others. And finally, costuming will echo that of classic fantasy films, with robes being the main attire of the masses. The market for fantasy science fiction aesthetic genre hybrids has been saturated and slowly growing as well with the introduction of the superhero movie into pop culture. By reinventing the idea of a classic fantasy plot and adding elements of science fiction and the Western, Mycteria can add something refreshing to the market. Of course, as it plans to be an epic trilogy, films like the Star Wars series and the Lord of the Rings trilogy have a fairly dominant share of the market. However, by focusing more so on fantasy and science fiction aesthetics, and by bringing in more interesting genre influences to the plot, character archetypes, and narrative as a whole, Mycteria is truly something different. As well as this, the stars we would choose to act in are very important into bringing a wider audience, especially in the context of science fiction epics. The main actors we have chosen are Clive Owen as our protagonist, Oscar Isaac as the antagonist, and the supporting actors are Jeffrey Dean Morgan, Dolph Lundgren, Jack Dylan Grazer, Christopher Walken, Hayley Atwell, and Kevin Sorbo, with the cameo voices of Christopher Plummer, Sean Connery, and Liam Neeson. We also plan to implement Denis Villeneuve as a director, as his connection to contemporary epic science fiction films is very strong, with examples such as Blade Runner 2049, Arrival, and soon to come Dune. The opportunity for transmedia coverage from Mycteria is almost endless. Comics are a strong outlet for fantasy and science fiction genre stories, as well as expanding on the information shown in the film trilogy, which fans of epic fantasy and science fiction media already enjoy. As well as this, because the setting is in a new universe, the potential for spin-offs are also endless, exploring how the events of the main trilogy affected other areas of the galaxy. The music is also something very important to fantasy epics, and so the soundtrack is another interesting way to delve into other media. We want Trevor Jones to compose the soundtrack, as his work in The Dark Crystal, The Last of the Mohicans, and The Labyrinth are very iconic to the fantasy genre, and have the sound we wish to have following the story of Mycteria. Finally, video games are another very important aspect of fantasy and science fiction genre hybrid media, as the demographic falls into both media areas strongly. And so, by making video games surrounding the plot of Mycteria, fans can learn more about the plot, as well as play through their own favourite parts of the films themselves. Because of the epic scale of science fiction genre films, the film is planned as a trilogy, but by separating the film into 3, the world building can unfold more naturally and comfortably. As a genre hybrid that plays with reality fiction as hard as science fiction and fantasy do, being able to world build within a trilogy can also allow for more time to focus on the protagonist and supporting characters, as well as the main overarching plot, rather than trying to fit everything into one film. As well as these points, the runtime for the film is already estimated to be around 2.5 hours. Because fans of epic fantasy and science fiction already enjoy this length of content, and by adding too much to this would discourage said fans to reach out into transmedia options.
In conclusion, this is the biggest film event of a lifetime. It is some of the biggest stars in existence, it's a revival of classic cinema, it's an epic tale of heroes, villains, sword and sorcery, wars and conquest, and creatures and wildlife beyond imagination. It is a highly marketable film, with opportunities for a lot of merchandising, as well as opportunities for spin-offs and TV series. This is a chance of a lifetime, and you don't want to miss it.